All right, everybody. So today we have with us again Lyle McDonald. How you doing, man?
Howdy, doing well.
So, as with all of my podcasts, I start with a charity donation, and this one's a little more personal. So, a friend of mine in South Carolina, there is a local charity that she's in favor of. I'm going to read it here called the Cotton Branch Farm Sanctuary. Their line here is a forever home for abused and neglected farm animals. So, basically, donations go to help those animals, and so that's where I'll
Awesome.
have a link today.
Awesome.
Yep. So, Lyle, it's been interesting in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I so originally I kind of talked to you about the hip thrust versus squat study that came out,
Sure.
and that's
Yeah.
definitely something we're going to dive into today. And then it
Yeah.
was kind of weird because I know you had said that you wouldn't want to, and I hope this is okay to put publicly, that you don't want to debate Brett. I guess just because of some issues you guys have had in the past, and I guess
Yep.
he was kind of disrespectful to people with mental illness and stuff like that. And
Yep.
so I Yep. And so, like I said, I definitely understand that. And so I figured we just get kind of your side here.
Sure.
But then, of course, in the last, I guess, just day or two, more stuff has come out with Brett that I saw posted in your group. I've seen posted on podcasts. I've seen posted in other places about, his issues with relationships and things like
Sure.
that. So I don't know if we want to air out all that
Well,
here.
I'll be honest. I'm not going to talk about that. His
Sure.
personal stuff, kind of like what happened with another individual in the fitness industry last year.
Right.
I mean, it's interesting that it came out. I followed it. However, I'm staying out of it.
Sure. I think it's a safe
I've
bet.
already closed. I've closed discussion in my group. Any further discussion needs to be between the people involved. And one of the things we're going to address is the whole study. He made it very personal about
Mm,
one of the researchers, and I want to focus on this. He can't pretend to be a PhD or make a big deal about that, and then make personal attacks. And I'm not interested in his personal life. I want to talk about science.
perfect. So I think that's a good call. And I know one of the things that you're referring to there is that the study was by Barbalo. And I had actually reached out to him after you and I
Hmm,
talked, and he had
good.
mentioned that he said, I'm honored, but I guess his English is not up to par at this point.
Okay. Fair
And
enough.
so he said that he's working on that. So maybe in the future we'll be able to talk, but for now he said a podcast
Okay.
wouldn't be ideal for him.
Yeah,
Um,
fair enough.
but I think what you're referring to is where he was kind of saying like the "do you even lift" to
Right.
Barbalo, which obviously is probably not what we should be referring to when we're talking about studies here.
Well, yes, sort of to go back, like to give background. I don't know if you want to get into this. So,
Yeah,
Brett is basically made a career at an industry out of the hip thrust exercise, right? And the hip thrust is kind of a modified glute bridge, where your upper back is up on a bench of some sort, and you have some sort of resistance. Originally, it's a barbell, sometimes it's tubing, and you're doing basically isolated hip extension. And don't get me wrong, right? And we'll get into this. The number of misinterpretations of people's people's discussion of this study was immense, right? But we'll get into that. I'm not against the hip thrust. I've used it. I was using glute bridges before anyone had ever heard of Brett because I'm old, right? Back, I was using this stuff with bands and tubing around the knees to fix problems in the 1990s, right? But he has made a career out of it. And among his other claims was that the glute bridge is superior to the back squat for building the glutes. And he made some other truly hilarious claims. He said that Ronnie Coleman would have had bigger glutes if he'd done the hip thrust. He said that Andy
right.
Bolton, one of the greatest steppers of all time, would have done better with it, and that Usain Bolt would sprint faster with the hip thrust. And by that point, you've gone full potato. Anyway, he was basing much of this on earlier data, at least two pieces of which came out of his lab, showing that uh, EMG, which measures muscle activation, was higher in the isolated glute bridge versus the squat. Now, couple things. Surface EMG is a rough measure, right? Basically, you put pads or on top of the muscle, and it's measuring electrical signal. It picks up a lot of other muscles. I had it done to me when I was in exercise physiology because I was a cyclist and I was the only one that had my leg shaved. So I was the one that they stuck the pads to because they didn't have to worry about ripping hair out of my legs. And like to give you an idea of the problems with it, in the early days of EMG, they kept picking up this signal at like 120 volts or watt, I guess volts. And it was this constant signal no matter what muscle they measured. It was the electrical outlet, right? So now, which is fine, but now they have to, like, when they take the measurements, they have to put in whatever the computer program is to remove that, because that's, so like if I put something over your butt, all it's getting is a gross electrical signal of your glutes, of your piriformis, of your hip external, right? They do fine needle electromyography where they stick a little needle, like an acupuncture needle. It's not done often. It's very technically, it's very involved. It's very invasive. Anyway, EMG is at best a rough measure of what the muscle is doing. And somewhat amusingly, there's a paper written that basically points out that EMG activation numbers are not indicative of muscle hypertrophy. And Bret is one of the authors on it.
Yeah.
Right? So he wants to have it both ways. And also frequently in these studies, he is comparing a half squat to the EMG. Right? Now, I won't disagree with him. Right? Bodybuilders for years used sort of a half squat with a narrow stance specifically to take the glutes out of the exercise. But if he's going to say that squats don't build the butt well, I would point him to an Olympic lifter. They don't do hip thrusts. They do pulling and they do other things, don't get me wrong. But the claim as it was stated was not only overzealously made, but was, it was a little bit loaded. So a couple weeks ago, a study comes out by a group. I want to say they're in Spain, but don't swear me to that. The lead researcher was Barbalho, and I forget the rest of the researchers, which is interesting because they put out a couple studies last year addressing the whole volume issue that were that's the other big debate still raging in the industry.
Right.
And they basically showed that under certain conditions, basically if the sets are taking to true failure, that higher volumes above about 5 or 10 sets per workout per week were not only not better, they were worse because it was an excessive training load. Now, their research is very well done in terms of methodology. Most of these studies that measure muscle growth use ultrasound, right? Like what you would use to look at pregnancy. It's a good measure. Everybody uses it. But as opposed to other research groups, the Barbalho group blind the person doing the measurement. The person doing the measurement actually has nothing to do with the study, the way they do it. So it reduces the risk of bias, right? Their study was 6 months long. It had a very significant number of people, and they actually adhere to the statistics, right? So their group does good work. So they do this study and they compared a full squat to the hip thrust under basically the same conditions. It was, I want to say, 3 months long, and enough people. The ultrasound tech was blinded. They made sure they were doing a full squat, like they measured it to 140 degrees of knee flexion versus a hip thrust. And what they found was rather conclusively, well, several things. One, the full squat generated better glute growth than the isolated hip thrust. The full squat also built the quads better than the hip thrust, which is not surprising. The hip thrust is not a quad exercise. When they looked at strength, they found that the hip thrust improved the hip thrust, but not the squat. The squat improved the squat and the hip thrust, right? Which again, which nobody cares about. This is all about building the butt, right? Nobody listening to this, nobody worrying about this debate could give the first damn about their hip thrust 1RM for the most part, or whatever. So this paper came out and a bunch of us kind of jumped on it. And I wasn't the only one by far and away, which was good because whenever I'm critical of stuff, it's real easy for the group to dismiss me by just pointing out that I'm mean. That's pretty much what it comes down to. They don't like me, but it wasn't just me. Well, Bret was unhappy. And I knew he would be his entire career. He wrote a 600-page book on training the glutes. I can't imagine. It's a chapter at most. I can't imagine. He sells a hip thrust machine. One of the other people that got critical, who wrote some of the dumbest criticisms, just happened to have invented the Nautilus hip thrust machine. Nah,
really?
There's no conflict of interest there. Anyway, so Bret was unhappy with this, as I knew he would be, because as a certain group of individuals in the fitness industry, the evidence-based fitness industry, have shown, science only matters when it supports the bottom line, right? Somehow, sloppy science that they agree with will get defended, and methodologically sound science that doesn't will get dumped on. It's really interesting how that works. And don't get me wrong, we're all biased. I laugh when I hear these guys go, I'm going to give you an unbiased analysis. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. And anyone who thinks they're unbiased is lying to themselves and or to the world. We're all biased. We all have our own biases. It's the nature of the beast, right? That's why we gauge science with there's Cochrane reviews, there's tools that are to examine studies to show potential sources of bias, right? And you can never eliminate it completely. You're trying to reduce the risk of it. Blinding the ultrasound tech, for example. Having an independent researcher validate your claims. It's that simple. If every positive study is coming out of your lab, well, there's a problem. I think one of my favorite examples back in the 90s, because researchers got really irritated, right? They would do all the research on supplements, and then someone else would make all the money.
Right.
And Steve Nissen decided he wanted to get in on that. So suddenly his lab started pumping out all this great positive research on that supplement HMB, hydroxymethylbutyrate. He owned his patent to it. Convenient. And somehow other labs could never seem to replicate his results.
Right.
Now, and I don't like dismiss him because of fine. That's just another dismissal. Look at the data, look at the science. Was it good or wasn't it? It's just that simple, or it should be. So anyway, Bret wrote a piece in Alan Aragon's research review, and I knew he would. I knew exactly what route he was going to go down. So first, he threw out a bunch of anecdotal evidence. I guess one of his criticisms, and this isn't worth it, was that the ratio between the full squat and the hip thrust poundages weren't maybe what you'd expect, right? The hip thrust is great. It's got a tiny little lever arm. Weak people can move all kinds of weight.
Right.
Like, it's just staggering because just because of the physics of it. And the numbers were fairly similar. And I didn't ever looked into this. It depends on where you put the bar. After the study came out, Brad sent out this survey going, I want to know what your squat and hip thrust ratios are. And I knew what he was going to do. I said, he's going to use that data to say that these are the numbers he's got. And the study was, and I was right. So among other arguments, he said, here's this data on hip thrust to squat ratio from my lab. Well, we talked about that. The survey he sent out, some fitness app, right? The plural of anecdote is not science and never has been. But somehow, and this is another rant, another thing, the evidence-based fitness groups, right? And evidence-based used to mean science, has now decided that anecdotes count, which is its own, and I'm not saying anecdotal evidence is useless. However, what I think is what they're saying is their anecdotes count, right? Because they've been dismissing other groups' anecdotes for years, but somehow their anecdotes now count. I bet you anecdotes that disagree with them somehow are only anecdotes. Anyway, so he played the anecdotal evidence card, which I knew he would. At some point, he said, after doing it, he said, this is why you should only listen to people that have a PhD or have been trained. That's called an appeal to authority. Sure. Right, that goes back to the good old days of ivory tower science. We with the PhDs, we the high men of academia are the only ones that get to opine on this. Right. And then at the very end, he went full potato, and he pulled up a picture of Barbalho, the head researcher, and wrote, now I don't mean to be petty, but essentially he said, does this guy even lift? You can't have it both ways. You can't say, only I have a PhD, but does this guy even lift? If you go back about 20 years when research first started to become part of exercise science, you know who used the do you even lift thing? The bro bodybuilders.
Right.
And now suddenly we've come full circle. Now, admittedly, yes, we've got a lot of PhDs and researchers that are lifters themselves. That's not necessarily a bad thing because they are bringing knowledge of that to a field that traditionally didn't know. Some of the early studies I read on weight training, it's like, this is asinine. You guys don't even know what's done in practice. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but that's what's called an ad hominem attack. This is when you dismiss someone out of hand based on a personal attack. I used to get it all the time, right?
I'm sure.
And again, you can't play the science card. You can't say I'm a PhD and then go down that road. And hilariously, people jumped down his throat for this one. Not just me. I don't even think I ever really, maybe I addressed it online. I don't even remember.
Yeah.
But I will, again, it's easy when I'm the only one being critical because, again, they'll just ad hominem me. Lyle's an asshole. Don't listen to him. Okay.
Right.
I mean, I'm right, but that's fine. But for him to do that to a researcher in a lab doing much methodologically sounder research than labs that he supports is pitiful.
Sure.
And again, he just kind of went, I don't know what he was thinking. I'm a little stunned and disappointed that Alan would let him run that because Alan's research review has always been aimed at science, and that's pitiful. It's just pitiful. So like that's, and they, again, so that was the basis of it. And the only conclusion I drew was, according to this study, the full squat, and these were trained female lifters, was superior for growth in the butt than the isolated hip thrust. That's it. That was the only conclusion. And then, so that was that. And then there was Bret going off the rails. And from what I can tell, it's really interesting and again, I don't follow most of this because A, most of these people have me blocked, but B, I just don't care. I can really, unless people send me screenshots of stuff, I got better things to do, believe it or not. Is suddenly this entire group of people, right? This internet circle that Bret is part of, they were shockingly quiet about this in both directions. Neither did they defend. And again, maybe they said stuff that I didn't see. Like I can only report on what I did or did not see. I don't know because again, I don't follow them closely. But people send stuff to me that they didn't come to his defense over when people jumped down his throat for the ad hoc, but they didn't attack him either. I think they figured their best bet was just to keep their heads down and hope nobody noticed. But I myself and other people who pay attention. Anyway, so that happened, and the extension of that is then everybody I saw was like, people arguing about squats versus hip thrust. Why not do both? It's like, no. You're missing the point of all of this. Bret has based a 10 to 15 year career in an entire industry on this one claim. Well, a very solid study that, yes, should be replicated. It needs one study doesn't necessarily, another lab do this. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to, saying that he's wrong. And somehow, based on do you even lift, that study is not valid. Okay, that's not science. And no one's saying don't do both. No one's saying that there aren't times when the hip, and even the researchers said that. They said there may be situations, like if you've got knee problems, and there are others I can think of where the hip thrust may be the right. No one's saying the hip thrust doesn't build the glutes. No one's saying anything other than what was said. And in this study, squats were superior to hip thrust. And the only point of it being that this goes against a claim that has built him an entire industry and a facility called the Glute Lab, which based on this study would appear to be incorrect. And that's kind of it, right? There are absolutely times I've said this for years, even though I don't particularly care for him as a person. And hip thrusts are great exercise for many women. It allows them to isolate the glutes, which can be a good thing. Many women, frequently their legs outstrip their upper body strength-wise. What they can comfortably shoulder because of a relatively weaker upper body may not be a good stimulus to the lower body, and the hip thrust takes, I was never, but unfortunately on the internet, if you say X, people make a whole bunch of uncritical inferences about, so what you're saying is, no, what I'm saying is what I'm saying, and that's it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, and people are like, well, people need to qualify this and qualify that. I go, well, I never saw Bret qualify it. I never saw him say glute hip thrust may be superior under these conditions. So why are we suddenly held to a different standard? So yeah, I use both of them with my powerlifting trainee because I need to get her extra glute work. I've used them with other people. It's not, again, the study said what it said and nothing more. So that's basically sort of the gist of it. Bret has his EMG studies. And one of the papers that was done, it was adolescent male sprinters. They found that the hip thrust was superior to improve sprint speed compared to a half squat. Well, again, I don't disagree. The glutes get very involved in the bottom position. That's just a way to load the study. It's to compare one exercise to something that doesn't effectively load the glutes. So anyway, so that's just sort of like the overall gist of it. And that's why, I suggest, and so, I don't even know if Barbalho ever saw this. And I'm also told, like, people don't realize this. People think of science as being this very pure, polite set of people. Oh, if they only knew. Scientists talk mad shit about each other. They don't do it publicly. That's the difference. You don't hear them doing it because there's a certain level of decorum expected.
Right.
I'm always amused when I read letters to the editor because they will write in this very polite, passive-aggressive language. We read with great interest the results of Barbalho and all regarding the hip thrust and squat, which basically means these guys are so dumb they couldn't science their way out of a paper bag, right? Like the undercurrent of passive-aggressive, these guys are idiots, just makes me laugh. And I'm told that there is some beef, right, between there's the one lab, and this includes researchers like James Bear Fisher, Paolo, I'm going to mispronounce it, Gentile, several others. They're more on the low volume, high intensity end of things. And then we've got the folks on the high volume. And you can kind of watch them do that. When you read letters to the editor, you see kind of these warring philosophies of science. And that's perfectly fine, and that's just part of science. Told that Bret and this other research group, or sort of the whole crew, there's some drama there. I don't know the specifics, and it's not really relevant because end of the day, I think any study, I don't like such and such did the study, ergo I'm going to no. Look at the study on its own merits. Was it done methodologically soundly? Did it follow the statistics? Were the methods done properly? To me, at the end of the day, that's kind of, I don't really give a crap about the personal drama. Was the science good or not?
Right. I think it's interesting with anytime you have, of course, they're going to try to be professional about it, but I'm not surprised to hear that about PhDs or anybody, among like doctors. Like, for example, I would say in my practice, half of what I do is maybe more surgical and half is more cosmetic. And there's LVI, Las Vegas Institute, and then there's Dawson, which is like down, I think, in Florida. And they're both very well respected, but you'll hear practitioners of different ones saying like, oh yeah, he goes to this one. He goes like, there's just that air of it. And of course, when they meet each other, it's all cordial. And then when they're not around each other, it's different.
Right. So
it's
go to the conference. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's any professional, endeavor like that, it's not all going to be Instagram flame wars and stuff, but it's still happening. It's just kind of underneath the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I kind of, and like this thing, it's like, okay, so something that if he was going to put on his science hat and write a criticism letter to the editor, it would address the science. But since it was in this popular thing, he went down the do you even lift? And it's like, okay, that's really the road you want to take on top of the other, logical fallacies that were in there. So anyway, that was, like I said, the conclusion was only what it was. This says nothing about exercise selection for any given individual. That's always because I saw a bunch of people are just like, oh, exercise has to be selected based on the person. Change my mind. I go, yeah, of course it is. You've missed the point entirely. Yeah. You've missed the point of what this was all about from the beginning to the end. So anyway, so that's kind of the big thing. And it won't, honestly, without getting into any of it, like that whole thing with the hip thrust paper, I think has been drastically overshadowed by what happened this week. I don't think
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think people are going to really care about that going
At
forwards.
this point,
But yeah, the less said about that, the better.
right? Yeah,
Oh, what a mess. Oh, what a world. So
yeah, yeah. We won't get
anyway.
into it, but it was interesting.
Nope.
When I got the message, I was like, oh, all right. And then I saw more and more people. I thought it was kind of a secret, and then I just saw like I had people messaging me about it. I was kind of surprised, but it is what it is.
Yeah, like I wouldn't have known, but somebody put up the podcast in my group, and somebody else sent it to me, and I was like, "Oh wow, okay, that's just the thing that happened." But
Yeah, yeah.
so,
I
so
wanted
it
to
goes.
ask about the weight. So he was saying that in the study, one of the reasons or the flaws in his opinion was that the weights weren't high enough because relative to squat, most people can hip thrust a lot more. Were the
Yes,
people going to failure in this study, or were they? So they were.
yes,
So then shouldn't that kind of take care of the weight
sure.
issue? I mean,
And that
by
was
saying,
yes, and that was a point. That was a point that I made. Is one thing that this lab does, and they were, and this ends up in, like, if you want to like get into some of the some of the whole volume
Mhm.
arguments, this ends up being a really big issue. How you define failure, because the studies are frequently defining it differently. But one
Right.
thing the Barbalo group does, because they come from sort of that background, is they're going to true muscular failure. And I mean, basically, if you're taking two groups and we're doing, okay, 10 reps to true muscular failure, that's 10 reps to true muscular failure. Like I said, I think part of the reason the differential was there, somebody sent this to me and I should go back and look at it, right? A lot of how much you can use will just depend on where you put the bar. Or even where you put your back, because that changes the physics. And I believe somebody said that the way it was done in the study, there's an American method of doing hip thrust. I don't
Mm.
know. I don't keep up with any of this. I read research. I truly, like, I don't follow any of this stuff. I only see it when people show it to me. And that, like, and I'd have to go back and look, that I think they put the bar in a different place. Don't swear me to that. But
Mm.
yeah, but as other research has now shown, basically the loading doesn't really matter if you're going to true failure. And this group, their definition of failure is pushing as hard as possible till the bar won't move. Like it is true muscular failure, whereas many of the other studies use form failure. So I don't know if that's necessarily a valid criticism. I would counter argue, right, because he has convinced an entire legion of trainees basically not to back squat. Of course, their ratio on the hip thrust is going to be higher. That's what they're training,
Mm.
right? Specificity. Now, yes, I can guarantee, like, if I took a big squatter, and this is the other reason that I'd never bought this whole argument, right? That somehow the full squat was inferior for training the hip thrust. I guarantee you, if I take a big Olympic squatter, the amount of weight, like, they will be able to dust any human being on the hip thrust the first day out. I
Yeah.
guarantee it. And I believe there was actually somebody did this. I believe many years ago, somebody who had a pretty big squat who had never done the hip thrust basically went to Brett's lab or whatever, the gym or what, and basically got into a contest and just smoked him. Again, I could have dreamt this up. It wouldn't be the first time.
Huh.
But it's like, yeah, if you've got a big squat, you're going to have big hip thrust and vice versa. But if you're going to total muscular failure, what this whole other body of research has shown is that it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So, is that a legitimate criticism? Again, I'd have to go look at exactly what they did physics-wise, where they put the bar compared to where he puts the bar. So,
Do you know Chris Duffin, a very like elite powerlifter?
mhm.
So he is, I guess he somewhat friendly with Brett, but he made a video on the hip thrust years ago, and
Uh-huh.
his opinion was that he likes the hip thrust, that he incorporates it, but that he thinks people hugely use it wrong. He's against the one rep maxing of it and going with
Oh,
crazy heavy
yeah.
weights. He actually thinks it should be. So he had in that video, he said, I forget the exact proportion, but he said, if you're deadlifting, X amount of weight, you should only be hip thrusting zero point 0.3 or zero point 0.4 times that, whatever it was, a significantly
Yeah.
smaller amount. Because he talked about,
Okay.
yeah, which is why I thought it was interesting relative to what was being said here. He thinks a lot lower because he talks about, getting that full contraction at the very tip.
Sure.
and all of that. So I wasn't sure if you had heard that perspective, but he was pretty against these very heavy hip thrusts that have become really popular.
Yeah, yeah. And like I said, I don't follow a whole lot of this online. So, I mean, I haven't seen other coaches, talk about, a lot of their guys who get really heavy, it starts to kind of tear them up. Because it's just like, no, I mean, there's also just the simple aspect of having that bar. I mean, it's funny, another entire growth industry is pads for the hip thrust so that you
Yeah,
don't
right.
grind down your pelvis. By doing them, which is kind of its own funny thing. Hang on. This is the bar. I'm looking at the barbell paper itself. It says the bar was placed symmetrically at the crease of the hips, slightly above the pelvis, which is actually really interesting. I always thought the bar went below the pelvis, towards the knee.
Can you repeat that again? Where did they have it?
They said the hip thrust started with the participant sitting on the floor, lining the upper back on a padded bench. The bar was placed symmetrically at the crease of the hips, slightly above the pelvis, which would suggest to me that it's closer to the head.
Yeah.
I always thought the bar went below.
When I've done them, I've done it a little bit below. Yeah, it's more comfortable.
Yeah, same here. When I had Sumi do, she does it a little bit below. So maybe that was it. Like I said, I think the funniest, this was somebody else. There was one of the criticisms, the first criticism I saw, this guy, Pete Holman. And he was like, because they took the full range of squat, 140 degrees of knee flexion. And he was like, oh my God, that's so incredibly deep. I'm going to assume that these people were trained power and Olympic lifters. Well, that's just a dumb assumption. And 140 degrees, especially for a woman, is actually not that. I mean, it's a full squat.
Yeah.
A lot of people, I think that, hang on, where's my video? Think that a half squat, that's 90 degrees. No. If you actually look at a 90-degree knee angle, it's like that, right? This is because your shin can't be vertical, right? A 90-degree knee angle in the squat, people are barely bending their knees. 140 is, but he was just like, oh my God, that is so ridiculously deep. I'm like, no, have you never trained a woman? Women are incredibly flexible and mobile in that way. Like that's just a full squat. So anyway,